Retribution for the wicked. Haunted by guilt. Summary. In a remote village shrouded in eerie stillness, Mark and Sean, two reckless villagers, commit an act of horrifying animal cruelty, killing a trusting dog in a drunken haze. Their callousness awakens a chilling curse. Strange occurrences unfold, and the dog's spectral presence haunts the perpetrators. Sean meets a mysterious and terrifying end, while Mark's life spirals into paranoia and violence, driving him to abuse his wife, Emily. Alone and consumed by guilt, Mark is tormented by the ghost of the dog, which speaks of retribution. The haunting escalates until Mark is reduced to a shell of his former self, muttering incoherently about spectral eyes and whispers in the wind. The story captures the horror of karmic justice, intertwining supernatural elements with the psychological unraveling of a cruel man. It serves as a stark reminder of the price of cruelty and the unforeseen power of guilt and retribution. The haunting tale, steeped in fear and drama, leaves the village with a cautionary legend, and the spectral dog's presence lingers as a chilling echo in the whispers of the wind. Part 1. A quiet village. The village of Willow Creek lay bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The usual tranquility of the evening was thickened by an almost unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The streets, empty and shrouded in the long shadows of ancient trees, carried a haunting air, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Mark and Sean, lifelong friends and infamous troublemakers, sat beneath a gnarled oak tree near the edge of the village. A makeshift table between them was cluttered with bottles of cheap liquor, their contents nearly drained. Sean tipped his head back, letting the fiery liquid burn its way down his throat. "What a dull day," he muttered, his voice slurring slightly as he slammed the bottle onto the wooden table. Mark, who was staring at the horizon where the sun dipped behind distant hills, gave a low chuckle. "Dull? You want excitement?" Sean, his tone was thick with mischief, his smile crooked, the kind of smile that often heralded bad decisions. Sean leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What are you thinking?" Mark gestured lazily toward a yard nearby, where a lone dog lay tied to a post. The animal, an old but loyal mutt named Bruno, had been a fixture of the village for years. Its brown fur gleamed in the soft light, and its tail wagged lazily as it dozed. Sean squinted at the dog and shook his head. "You're not serious?" Mark's grin widened. "Oh, I'm serious. That thing barks at everything that moves. It's been driving me insane. Tonight, we teach it a lesson." His voice carried a dark undertone, one that made Sean pause, but not for long. Fueled by alcohol and the dangerous camaraderie of shared recklessness, Sean nodded slowly. The two men rose unsteadily to their feet, their laughter echoing eerily through the silent village. As they approached the dog, Bruno lifted his head and looked at them with eyes full of trust. Sean hesitated for a moment. "Maybe we shouldn't," he began, but Mark waved him off. "Don't go soft on me now," Mark snapped. He grabbed a rusted knife from the pocket of his jacket, its blade dull but serviceable. "You want excitement? Let's make this a night to remember." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Bruno's tail wagged again, his trust unwavering as Mark approached. But the dog's ears twitched, and a low growl escaped his throat, as if sensing the darkness in Mark's intentions. Sean shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't stop his friend. The first cry was sharp and filled with agony, a sound that pierced the stillness and sent shivers racing down the spines of anyone who might have heard it. Blood pooled in the dirt, dark and vivid under the dimming sky. The dog's body twitched once, twice, and then lay still. Mark wiped the blade on his pant leg, his expression cold and detached. "There, no more barking." Sean swallowed hard, the adrenaline mixing unpleasantly with the alcohol in his veins. Let's get out of here," he muttered. As they staggered away from the scene, the wind picked up, carrying with it an unnatural chill. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the village into shadow. Neither man noticed the faint rustling behind them, nor the pair of glowing eyes that seemed to materialize from the darkness, watching, waiting. The men returned to their table under the oak, each swigging from their bottles in silence. But the stillness of the night had taken on an oppressive weight, and even their alcohol-induced bravado couldn't dispel it. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, his laughter now hollow. "It's just a dog," he muttered, more to himself than to Sean. Nothing to worry about. Sean's eyes darted toward the shadows surrounding them. "You feel that? It's like we're being watched." Mark waved a dismissive hand. "You're drunk. Shadows don't have eyes." But Sean's unease persisted, and as the hours dragged on, even Mark began to feel it, a creeping sensation of being observed, of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception. The wind carried faint, mournful howls that seemed to circle them, growing louder with each passing minute. "Enough," Mark snapped, slamming his bottle down. "Let's go inside. This is ridiculous." The two stumbled toward Mark's small house, the door creaking ominously as they entered. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering lantern. Shadows danced on the walls, and the howling wind outside seemed to mock them. Sean sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I don't like this, Mark. I don't like this at all," Mark scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're acting like a child." Go to sleep. As the night wore on, Mark lay awake, his mind replaying the events of the evening. He could still hear Bruno's final cry, a sound that now seemed to echo in the silence of his home. He turned over, trying to shake the feeling, but sleep wouldn't come. Then came the scratching. Faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind. But it grew louder, more insistent, as though claws were dragging across the wooden walls of the house. Mark sat up, his heart pounding. "Sean," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" Sean stirred, groggily rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from just outside the door. Mark froze, his blood turning to ice. "It's nothing," he said quickly, more to reassure himself than Sean. "Probably just the wind." But the growl deepened, and the scratching resumed, now accompanied by the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. Sean was fully awake now, his eyes wide with fear. "Mark, what did we do?" Mark didn't answer. He grabbed the knife from the table, his hand trembling as he moved toward the door. The growling stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, he flung the door open. The lantern light spilled onto the empty yard, illuminating nothing but the swaying grass and the gnarled branches of the oak. Mark let out a shaky laugh. "See? Nothing. Just our imaginations." But as he turned to close the door, his breath caught. Two glowing eyes stared back at him from the darkness, unblinking and filled with a cold, otherworldly fury. The door slammed shut, and Mark stumbled back, his face pale. "It's just a dog," he muttered again, but the words felt hollow. The growling resumed, louder and more menacing, and the house seemed to tremble with each sound. The nightmare had only just begun. Part 2. A cruel act. The night descended over Willow Creek like a shroud, its usual tranquility shattered by what Mark and Sean had unleashed. Drunk and careless, they stumbled back toward the yard where Bruno, the loyal village dog, lay bound, and oblivious to the dark intent of the two men. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step, as though the universe itself recoiled from what was about to transpire. Bruno lifted his head as they approached, his tail thumping weakly against the ground. His trusting eyes gleamed in the moonlight, reflecting nothing but innocent curiosity. Sean hesitated. "Mark," he murmured, "maybe we should just go home. It's too much." Mark spun around, his face twisted in frustration. "Don't chicken out now," he snapped. "It's just a dog. You said you wanted excitement." Sean looked down at the ground, avoiding Bruno's gaze. The dog, still unaware of the danger, let out a small yawn, his tail wagging slightly as if he were greeting an old friend. Mark sneered. "Look at him. Dumb mutt doesn't even know what's coming." From his pocket, Mark drew out a knife, its blade dull but menacing under the pale glow of the moon. The sight of it sent a chill through Sean's alcohol-soaked bravado. "Mark," he said again, his voice trembling now, we shouldn't do this." "Oh, grow up," Mark barked, advancing toward Bruno. "It's not like anyone's going to miss this mangy thing." Besides, it's been keeping me up at night with all that barking. Bruno's ears twitched as Mark approached, the dog's nose sniffing the air. He wagged his tail once more, his body shifting slightly as if to welcome his master's friend. For a moment, Mark faltered, his grip on the knife loosening as the dog's gaze locked onto his. There was something unsettling about those eyes, an ancient, knowing depth that seemed almost human. "Mark. Don't," Sean pleaded one last time, his voice breaking. But Mark shook his head, his resolve hardening. With one swift motion, he brought the knife down. The first yelp shattered the silence of the night, a sound so raw and filled with pain that it seemed to echo endlessly through the village. Bruno thrashed against his restraints, his cries growing weaker with each passing second. Blood pooled around the dog, dark and glistening under the moonlight. Sean turned away, bile rising in his throat, while Mark wiped the blade on his jeans, his face expressionless. "There," Mark said, his voice cold. "No more barking." Sean couldn't speak. He stared at Bruno's lifeless body, his stomach churning with guilt and nausea. "You're a monster," he whispered, his words barely audible. Mark shrugged. "It's just a dog," he repeated. But his tone was defensive now, as though he were trying to convince himself. "Let's go back." The two men stumbled away from the scene, leaving the yard eerily silent save for the whisper of the wind through the trees. But as they walked, a strange sensation began to creep over them. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally in the moonlight. Sean glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice quivering. Mark didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The alcohol no longer dulled his senses. Instead, it amplified the unease gnawing at him. The rustle of leaves behind them made both men stop in their tracks. Slowly they turned, their breath hitching as they scanned the darkness. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, a prickling sensation that raised the hairs on the back of their necks. "It's just the wind," Mark muttered, more to himself than to Sean. "Come on." They quickened their pace, but the oppressive silence followed them all the way back to the oak tree. Mark grabbed another bottle of liquor, his hands shaking as he struggled to twist off the cap. Sean sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. "We shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "Something feels wrong." Mark slammed the bottle onto the table, the liquid sloshing over the sides. "Enough. You're acting like a scared little kid. It was just a dog." But even as he said it, a part of him didn't believe it. His mind replayed the look in Bruno's eyes, the way the dog had trusted him until the very end. And then there was that sound, the cry that had torn through the night, raw and unnatural. It lingered in his ears, refusing to fade. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with an eerie intensity. The shadows around them seemed to deepen, and the faintest sound of scratching reached their ears. Sean's head shot up, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Mark shook his head, though his heart was pounding. "You're imagining things," he said, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Let's go inside." They stumbled into Mark's small house, the door creaking ominously as it swung shut behind them. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lamp, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sean collapsed onto a chair, his hands trembling as he reached for another drink. Mark paced the room, his nerves on edge. Then came the growl. Low and guttural, it seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Mark froze, his eyes darting around the room. "Sean," he whispered. "Did you hear that?" Sean nodded slowly, his face pale. The growl came again, louder this time, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift and ripple. The scratching resumed, more insistent now, as though claws were dragging across the wooden exterior of the house. Mark grabbed the knife from the table, his hands slick with sweat. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice shook. "Probably just an animal." Sean didn't respond. He was staring at the door, his eyes wide with terror. Mark followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. Two glowing eyes stared back at them from the darkness outside, unblinking and filled with an otherworldly malice. The growling intensified, and the house seemed to tremble under its weight. Mark backed away, the knife clattering to the floor as his hands went limp. "What?" "What is that?" The answer came in the form of a deafening howl, a sound so unearthly that it seemed to pierce their very souls. The nightmare was far from over. Part 3. A haunting begins. The night after Bruno's death, the village of Willow Creek was engulfed in an unnatural quiet. The stillness was thick, oppressive, as though the air itself mourned the tragedy no one dared to speak of. The residents, tucked away in their homes, felt the unease but couldn't name its source. It was as if the earth itself held its breath, dreading what was to come. Mark sat slumped in his small living room, the acrid stench of cigarette smoke mingling with the stale odor of spilled beer. His hands shook slightly as he raised the cigarette to his lips, inhaling deeply in a futile attempt to steady himself. Opposite him, Sean sat motionless, staring into the table as though hoping it would offer absolution. The silence between them was as heavy as their guilt. Outside, the wind carried a strange sound, a distant, keening wail that rose and fell like the cry of a wounded animal. It was faint but insistent, threading through the air like a lament. Sean shifted uneasily, glancing toward the window. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice hushed and taut. Mark exhaled smoke in a sharp burst, shaking his head. "It's the wind," he muttered. But the words sounded hollow even to him. His eyes darted to the shadowed corners of the room, where the flickering lamplight failed to reach. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. Sean pushed his chair back abruptly, the leg scraping against the floor. "Mark, this isn't normal," he said, his voice edged with panic. "Something's out there." Mark sighed, irritated more by his own mounting fear than Sean's. He stood, grabbing a flashlight from a nearby shelf. "Fine. Let's check it out," he said, though his bravado rang false. The door creaked as he opened it, revealing the night beyond. The cold air rushed in, sharp and biting, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. The beam of the flashlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the dirt path and the skeletal branches of the trees that lined it. The world outside seemed unnaturally still, as though frozen in time. "See?" "Nothing," Mark said, though he didn't lower the flashlight. He turned to go back inside, but a low growl stopped him in his tracks. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating in the air around them. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping itself around them like a physical presence. Mark's grip on the flashlight tightened as Sean grabbed his arm. "Mark," Sean whispered, his voice barely audible. "What? What is that?" Before Mark could respond, a pair of eyes appeared in the darkness, glowing with an otherworldly light. They were fixed on the two men, unblinking and full of a cold, seething rage. Mark stumbled back, the flashlight falling from his hand and rolling across the ground. Its beam cast wild, jagged shadows on the trees, but it could not pierce the oppressive darkness where the eyes hovered. Then the growling stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. A shadowy figure stepped forward, emerging from the void. It was Bruno, or what had once been Bruno. His fur was matted and slick with phantom blood, and his body shimmered as though caught between worlds. His eyes burned brighter than ever, their light searing into the men's souls. Sean let out a strangled cry and bolted back into the house, slamming the door behind him. Mark remained rooted to the spot, unable to move or look away. Bruno's spectral form advanced, his movements deliberate and slow. The growl that emanated from him was no longer the sound of an animal. It was a deep, guttural rumble, filled with pain, betrayal, and a thirst for vengeance. You're not real," Mark stammered, his voice trembling. "You can't be real." Bruno lunged, his incorporeal body passing through Mark like a gust of freezing wind. Mark gasped, clutching his chest as a sharp, icy pain radiated through him. He stumbled back into the house, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. Sean was huddled in a corner, his face buried in his hands. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice shrill with panic. Mark didn't answer. He staggered to the window, peering out into the night. The yard was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The wind howled again, and a faint scratching sound began to emanate from the walls of the house. Sean bolted upright, his wide eyes darting around the room. He grabbed a chair and shoved it against the door, as if the flimsy barrier could keep out whatever was stalking them. "This isn't real," he muttered, rocking back and forth. This isn't happening, but it was happening. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking against the wooden walls. Shadows danced across the room, their movements unnatural and almost sentient. The temperature plummeted, their breaths visible in the icy air. Then came the howling. It was a deafening wail, raw and guttural, that seemed to originate from within the house itself. Mark clapped his hands over his ears, sinking to his knees. Sean screamed, the sound merging with the howling until it was impossible to tell one from the other. The walls trembled, and the floorboards creaked under an unseen weight. The lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was silence, a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Then, in the corner of the room, two glowing eyes appeared. They hovered in the darkness, unblinking and filled with malice. Sean scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the floor as he tried to put distance between himself and the apparition. Mark groped for the knife he had dropped earlier, his fingers trembling as they closed around the hilt. The eyes moved closer, accompanied by the low, menacing growl. "Leave us alone," Mark shouted, his voice cracking. He brandished the knife, though his hand shook so violently it was almost useless. "We didn't mean to." The eyes blinked out, and the room was silent once more. But the dread remained, a tangible force that pressed down on them, suffocating and inescapable. The men sat huddled together in the darkness, too afraid to move. Outside, the wind continued to howl, carrying with it the faint, mournful wail of a dog betrayed. The haunting had only just begun. Part 4. Sean's downfall. The morning arrived with an unnatural stillness, as though the world itself held its breath. In Willow Creek, the cold seeped into every crevice, intensifying the lingering dread. Inside Mark's small house, the air was thick with silence, broken only by Sean's restless pacing. His face was pale, his movements jittery, as if his fear had taken physical form. "I can't stay here," Sean muttered, his voice trembling. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the door. "Something's out there. I can feel it." Mark sat slumped in a corner, clutching an empty bottle of whiskey. He raised his head slightly, his voice low and hoarse. "Where do you think you can go? It doesn't matter. Bruno's ghost, it'll find us." Sean whirled around, anger flaring. "You don't know that," he shouted, though his voice cracked with desperation. "I can't sit here and wait for whatever this is to happen. I need to leave. I need to breathe." Without waiting for a response, Sean grabbed his coat and bolted out the door. The cold morning air struck him like a slap, but he welcomed the sensation. It grounded him, offering a fleeting illusion of normalcy. He headed instinctively toward the riverbank, a place that had always brought him peace. The quiet gurgle of the water had a way of easing his mind, and he clung to the hope that it might do so now. As he approached the river, the familiar setting felt alien. The forest lining the bank loomed larger than usual, its shadows darker and deeper. The sound of the water, once soothing, now carried an unsettling distortion, like a faint whisper beneath the current. Sean shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. "It's just my imagination," he whispered, trying to steady his breathing. The river's always been safe, but no matter how he tried to convince himself, the unease grew. The air seemed heavier here, pressing against him like an unseen force. And then he felt it, the sensation of being watched. Slowly Sean turned, his breath catching in his throat. Bruno's spectral form stood at the edge of the forest, shrouded in a faint, otherworldly glow. His fur was matted and dark, his body shimmering like a mirage. But it was his eyes that paralyzed Sean. Glowing orbs of fiery malice. They bore into him with an intensity that stripped away any illusion of safety. No, Sean whimpered, stumbling backward. His foot caught on a rock, and he fell hard onto the damp ground. You can't be here. You're dead." The dog's growl rose, low and guttural, vibrating through the very air. It wasn't the growl of an animal, it was something deeper, something primal and filled with a rage that Sean couldn't comprehend. Bruno began to advance, his movements deliberate and silent. Each step seemed to drain the warmth from the air, leaving Sean trembling. "Stay away," Sean screamed, his voice breaking. He scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the muddy ground. "It wasn't my fault. I didn't kill you." Bruno's pace quickened, his spectral body blurring as he lunged. Sean's scream was swallowed by the roar of the river as the ghostly form passed through him. An icy pain shot through his chest, freezing his breath and sending darkness flooding his vision. He convulsed once, twice, and then fell still. The riverbank was still and eerie, the quiet broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. Sean's lifeless body lay sprawled in the mud, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot and unseeing, as if they had witnessed something no living soul was meant to behold. His hands were clenched tightly around tufts of damp grass, his clothes soaked through with the morning dew. The sun rose, casting pale light across the scene. The villagers, stirred by the unusual quiet, ventured out to the riverbank. Their collective gasp echoed through the air as they discovered Sean's body. The grim tableau silenced even the loudest of them, and whispers spread like wildfire. "What could have caused this?" a woman asked, clutching her shawl tightly. "Heart failure," a man suggested, though his voice faltered. "He must have been terrified of something cursed," another muttered, their tone heavy with superstition. "Something cursed him back in the village." The news of Sean's death spread quickly. Fear settled over Willow Creek, a palpable weight pressing on the people. Some avoided the river entirely, while others lit candles and muttered prayers. The story grew with each retelling, morphing into a cautionary tale of mysterious vengeance. Mark, however, knew the truth. He sat alone in his house, the shutters drawn tightly against the sunlight. His body felt numb, his mind replaying the events of the previous night in vivid detail: the glowing eyes, the growls, the sight of Bruno's ghost. He clenched his fist tightly, his knuckles white. Sean's death wasn't random, wasn't natural. It was retribution. As dusk fell over the village, Mark finally moved. He rose from his chair, his body heavy with exhaustion and dread. The house felt alive with shadows, each one shifting and creeping closer. He lit a candle, its flickering flame casting brief moments of clarity amidst the darkness. "Bruno," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" No answer came, but the air grew colder, and the candle flickered violently. Mark shivered, his breath visible in the chill. The weight of Bruno's vengeance pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. Sean's downfall was only the beginning, and Mark knew it. That night, the howls began again. Low, mournful wails that echoed through the village, chilling the blood of anyone who heard them. Mark lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his heart pounding with each sound. The house groaned as though under pressure, and the shadows seemed to stretch and grow, reaching for him. He closed his eyes tightly, hoping for sleep to take him. But the haunting wasn't done. Not yet. The ghost of Bruno had claimed Sean, and now it wanted Mark. It was only a matter of time. Part 5. Mark's Paranoia. The haunting didn't relent after Sean's death. Mark awoke every morning with a crushing weight in his chest, the memory of Sean's lifeless body etched into his mind. The oppressive silence of the house, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, whispers flitted through the air, and an unseen presence seemed to breathe down his neck. Mark tried to tell himself that none of it was real. Just tricks of the mind, he muttered, pacing the length of his small living room. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave him, and his reflection in the window often looked distorted, warped by fear and guilt. Emily, Mark's wife, returned home after hearing of Sean's death. She found Mark hunched over at the kitchen table, an empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. The sight of him unshaven, disheveled, and broken made her heart ache. "Mark," she began softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you need help. Whatever's happening, nothing's happening." Mark snapped, shrugging her hand away. His voice cracked with frustration, and his bloodshot eyes met hers. "You don't know what you're talking about. You weren't here." Emily flinched but didn't back down. "You've been drinking yourself into a stupor for days. You're not yourself." Let me help, I don't need help, Mark roared, slamming his fist on the table. The sound echoed through the house, startling both of them. You don't understand. It's not just me. Bruno is here, Emily froze, her brow furrowing in confusion. Bruno? The dog? Mark, that's impossible. Bruno's dead, I know he's dead, Mark shouted, his voice hoarse. I killed him. And now he's back, the confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. Emily stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to horror. You killed him, Mark turned away, unable to face her. It was stupid. A drunken mistake. Sean and I, we thought it didn't matter. But it does. It matters now. Emily took a step back, her face pale. Mark, do you hear yourself? You're talking like a madman. Maybe I am mad, he bellowed, spinning to face her. His hands shook as he gestured wildly. But that dog won't let me rest. He's here, Emily. He's watching me. Every night I hear him. I see him. And Sean's dead because of him. Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. This isn't just guilt, Mark. You need help. Let's go to the village elder. Maybe Father Thomas can. Father Thomas can't fix this, Mark interrupted, his voice rising. This isn't something a prayer can solve. It's too late. The tension in the room was suffocating. Emily stood frozen, torn between fear and pity. Mark's erratic behavior was unlike anything she had ever seen. She reached out to him again, her voice trembling. Please, Mark. Let me help you. Stay away from me, he shouted, backing away. His eyes darted around the room as though Bruno's ghost would materialize at any moment. You don't understand what's out there. If you stay, you'll be next. Just leave me alone, Emily hesitated, her hand hovering in the air. She wanted to argue, to convince him to see reason, but the raw fear in his voice made her falter. Slowly, she lowered her hand and turned toward the door. I'll stay at my sister's, she said quietly, but I'm coming back tomorrow, and you'd better be ready to talk. Mark didn't respond. He stood rigid, listening to the sound of the door closing behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, he felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The room seemed darker, the shadows more pronounced. A faint growl echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Bruno, Mark whispered, his voice shaking. What do you want from me? The growl grew louder, and the air grew colder. Mark backed into a corner, clutching the empty bottle as if it could protect him. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but he knew there was nowhere to run. The dog's vengeance was inescapable. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of scratching at the walls and low, mournful howls. Mark paced the house, muttering to himself, his paranoia spiraling out of control. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the candlelight made him jump. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real, he repeated, like a mantra. But as the hours dragged on, the line between reality and delusion blurred. The walls seemed to close in around him, and Bruno's glowing eyes appeared in every shadow. By the time dawn broke, Mark was a wreck. His hands were bloodied from clawing at the walls, and his voice was hoarse from screaming into the void. Emily returned that morning, her heart sinking as she stepped into the house. It was dark, the windows covered with makeshift barricades. The air was heavy with the stench of sweat and despair. Mark, she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. She found him in the corner of the living room, his knees drawn to his chest. He rocked back and forth, muttering incoherently. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his face pale and gaunt. Emily knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. Mark, it's me. I'm here. Please, let me help you. He didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on something behind her, his lips trembling as he whispered one word, Bruno. Emily turned slowly, her heart pounding. But there was nothing there. Just the shadows, stretching and shifting as the morning light crept through the cracks. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly as he shook. Whatever had happened to Mark, whatever was haunting him, it had consumed him entirely. Mark's days blurred into nights, each moment blending with the next in an unending loop of terror. The sounds in the house grew louder, more insistent. Bruno's presence became impossible to ignore. The ghostly growls turned to whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling Mark's name. One night, as Mark sat in the dim glow of a flickering candle, he saw Bruno fully manifest in the corner of the room. The dog's spectral form glimmered faintly, its eyes burning with an otherworldly rage. "Why?" Mark whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Bruno didn't respond. Instead, he moved closer, his steps silent, his figure unnaturally fluid. Mark scrambled to his feet, knocking the candle over in his panic. The flame extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then Bruno's growl rumbled through the air, deep and menacing. Mark screamed, stumbling backward until he hit the wall. He could feel Bruno's breath, cold and damp, against his skin. The dog's growl was inhuman now, a sound that resonated deep within Mark's chest, vibrating through his bones. The villagers outside heard the commotion and gathered near the house, their murmurs filled with fear and uncertainty. "Something's wrong with Mark," one of them said. "We need to help him," but no one dared enter. The sounds emanating from the house were not of this world. They heard Mark's screams, his desperate pleas for forgiveness, and the guttural growls that answered him. It was only when the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon that the house fell silent. When Emily returned, she found Mark lying in the middle of the living room. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. He was alive but unresponsive, his body trembling, as if caught in an eternal nightmare. Emily collapsed beside him, clutching his hand as tears streamed down her face. Whatever had happened that night, it had left Mark a broken shell of the man he once was. Bruno's vengeance was far from over, and Emily knew that the terror haunting their lives would not stop there. The shadows in the house seemed to whisper of more to come, their voices echoing the weight of guilt and despair. The cycle of fear was only beginning. Part 6. Emily escapes. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the shadows, felt like an unspoken threat. Emily tried to stay strong, but the man in front of her was no longer the Mark she had married. His eyes, bloodshot and haunted, darted around the room as though searching for something or someone that only he could see. "Emily," Mark hissed one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. He was hunched over, gripping a broken chair leg as if it were a weapon. "He's here. He's in the house." "Don't move." Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mark, there's no one here," she said softly, though her voice trembled. "Please, just put that down and come sit with me. We'll talk about this." Mark shook his head violently, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip on the makeshift club. "You don't understand. He's watching us. Every time you speak, you make it worse. He knows, Emily. He knows everything." The fear in his eyes sent a chill down her spine. Emily had tried to reason with him for days, but Mark's paranoia had spiraled out of control. The more she tried to soothe him, the more he lashed out. His fear had turned to anger, and his anger was now a storm waiting to unleash. That night, the storm broke. Mark had been pacing the living room for hours, muttering to himself. Emily sat silently in the corner, her hands gripping the edge of her chair as she watched him. She didn't dare speak, didn't dare move, lest she set him off. But the tension finally snapped when Mark turned on her, his face contorted with rage. "You're working with him, aren't you?" he bellowed, pointing the chair leg at her like a dagger. "You're part of this. You've been helping him this whole time." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Mark, no," she said, her voice shaking. "I would never." "Don't lie to me," he roared, his voice echoing through the house. "You've been plotting against me. That's why he won't leave. That's why I can't get away." He advanced on her, and for the first time, Emily felt true fear. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. She raised her hands, trying to calm him. "Mark, please, listen to me. I'm on your side. I'm trying to help you." But her words only seemed to fuel his rage. He slammed the chair leg against the wall, the sound reverberating through the room. "You're lying," he shouted. "You're lying. And I'm not going to let you destroy me." Emily didn't wait for him to take another step. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she bolted for the door. Mark lunged after her, his hand brushing against her arm, but she slipped through his grasp and threw open the door. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. She ran down the porch steps and into the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, Mark stood in the doorway, his silhouette illuminated by the dim light from inside. "You can't run forever, Emily," he shouted after her. "He'll find you too." She didn't look back. Her feet carried her down the dirt path, past the skeletal trees that lined the property. The wind howled through the branches, and for a moment she thought she heard a low growl carried on the breeze. Her fear pushed her to run faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she put as much distance as she could between herself and the house. When she finally reached the edge of the village, she collapsed onto her knees, tears streaming down her face. Her body trembled with exhaustion and fear, but she was safe for now. She looked back toward the house, its distant shape barely visible in the moonlight. Mark was still in there, alone with whatever had taken hold of him. She wanted to go back, to save him, but she knew she couldn't. Not yet. In the days that followed, Emily stayed with her sister Clara, who welcomed her with open arms. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Clara said, wrapping a blanket around Emily's shoulders. Emily didn't have the strength to tell her that she had. Mark, meanwhile, was left alone in the house. The first night after Emily fled, the silence was deafening. He wandered through the empty rooms, muttering to himself, his anger fading into a hollow despair. "She'll come back," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "She has to come back," but as the hours dragged on, his despair turned into something darker. The house seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing closer with each passing moment. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, and Bruno's growl echoed through the halls. Mark clutched his head, his fingers digging into his scalp as he tried to block out the sound. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The answer came in the form of a chilling laugh, low and guttural, reverberating through the house. Mark froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The laugh wasn't human. It was Bruno's, distorted and inhuman, filled with a malice that made Mark's blood run cold. He stumbled into the living room, his eyes darting around the shadows. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice trembling. "If you want me, then take me. Leave Emily alone." The room grew colder, and the flickering candle on the table extinguished itself. Mark was plunged into darkness, and in the silence he heard the sound of claws scraping against the floor. They were slow, deliberate, moving closer and closer. Mark backed into a corner, his hands shaking as he gripped the broken chair leg like a lifeline. The growling grew louder, and Mark squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry," but there was no mercy in the darkness. The last thing Mark saw before he passed out was Bruno's glowing eyes, burning with an unholy light as they loomed closer. When Emily returned the next day, she found the house in shambles. Furniture was overturned, the walls were scratched and gouged as though by massive claws. And in the middle of the living room lay Mark, unconscious but alive, his face pale and streaked with tears. Emily knelt beside him, her heart breaking as she cradled his head in her hands. "Mark," she whispered, "what have you done?" But Mark didn't answer. His lips moved soundlessly, his eyes fluttering beneath closed lids as if trapped in a nightmare. Emily knew then that whatever had taken hold of him wasn't finished. The house still felt heavy, oppressive, as though Bruno's presence lingered, waiting for its next move. Emily pressed her forehead against Mark's, her tears soaking into his hair. "I'll save you," she vowed, though she wasn't sure how. "I'll find a way to save you," but deep down, she feared that it was already too late. Part 7. The Ghost Speaks. The air in the house grew heavier with each passing moment, thick with an unnatural stillness that pressed down on Mark like a suffocating weight. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with a life of their own, twisting and shifting in the flickering candlelight. Mark sat in the middle of the living room, his knees drawn to his chest, rocking back and forth as he muttered incoherently. He had been alone for days. the silence broken only by the haunting sounds of claws scraping across the floor and low, guttural growls that seemed to echo from the walls. Mark had tried to shut it out, covering his ears, smashing bottles, screaming until his voice gave out, but nothing worked. Bruno was still there, waiting. "Leave me alone," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "I can't take this anymore." A sudden chill swept through the room, extinguishing the lone candle and plunging the house into darkness. Mark froze, his breath hitching as the temperature dropped. He could see his breath in the dim light filtering through the boarded-up windows, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The growling began again, louder this time, resonating through the room with an intensity that made Mark's chest tighten. He scrambled to his feet, his hands fumbling for the broken chair leg he had been using as a weapon. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice cracking. "If you want me, then come out." The growling stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that made Mark's heart race. Then, from the shadows, a pair of glowing eyes emerged, burning with an unholy light. They hovered in the darkness, unblinking, filled with a hatred so intense that Mark felt it seep into his very soul. "Bruno," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. His grip on the chair leg tightened as he took a shaky step backward. "What do you want from me?" The spectral dog stepped forward, its form shimmering like a mirage. Bruno's fur was matted and stained with phantom blood, and his once loyal eyes now burned with vengeance. His movements were slow and deliberate, each step echoing with an unnatural sound that made Mark's stomach churn. "You took my life," the dog said, its voice a chilling whisper that seemed to emanate from all around the room. The sound was inhuman, distorted, yet unmistakably filled with rage. "And now you will pay." Mark stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall. His legs gave out, and he slid to the floor, his hands trembling as he clutched the chair leg. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "It was a mistake. I was drunk." Silence. Bruno's voice thundered, shaking the walls of the house. The shadows writhed as if alive, and the temperature in the room plummeted further. "You showed no mercy, and now I will show none to you." Mark's tears streamed down his face as he shook his head violently. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, I'll do anything. Just leave me alone." Bruno's form grew darker, more solid, as he advanced on Mark. "Your apologies mean nothing," the ghost snarled. "You laughed as you ended my life. You thought I was just an animal. But I was more than that. I was loyal. I trusted you. And you betrayed me." The words cut through Mark like a blade, each syllable sinking deep into his chest. He dropped the chair leg, his hands covering his face as he sobbed. "I was wrong," he choked out. "I was wrong. I'll do anything to make it right. Anything." Bruno stopped inches away from Mark, his glowing eyes boring into the broken man before him. For a moment, there was silence, save for Mark's ragged breathing. Then the dog spoke again, his voice low and menacing. "You cannot make it right. But you will suffer. As I have suffered." Mark looked up, his face pale and streaked with tears. "What do you mean?" Bruno's growl deepened, and the room seemed to vibrate with its intensity. "You will know what it means to live in fear, to feel the weight of betrayal and guilt. You will know what it means to be powerless." The shadows around Bruno began to swirl, forming shapes that danced and writhed like specters. Mark tried to crawl away, but his body felt heavy, pinned by an invisible force. Bruno's eyes burned brighter, and the ghostly forms lunged at Mark, their spectral claws raking through his body without leaving physical marks but filling him with a pain that tore through his soul. Mark screamed, his voice raw and desperate, as the visions flooded his mind. He saw Bruno's final moments, the trust in the dog's eyes as Mark raised the knife, the pain and betrayal as life drained away. The scenes played on an endless loop, each repetition more vivid and excruciating than the last. "Stop," Mark screamed, clutching his head. "Please, stop." The shadows receded, and Bruno stepped back, his gaze unyielding. "This is only the beginning," the ghost said. "Your suffering has just begun." With that, the spectral dog vanished, leaving Mark alone in the darkness. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, but the echoes of Bruno's voice lingered, a chilling reminder of what had just transpired. Mark lay on the floor, his body trembling and his mind shattered. The house was silent once more, but the silence was far from comforting. It was a void, a reminder that the ghost had left, but only for now. As the first rays of dawn broke through the cracks in the boarded windows, Mark curled into a ball, his sobs quiet and broken. He knew he couldn't escape what was coming. Bruno's retribution was far from over, and the ghost's promise echoed in his mind, "You will suffer, as I have suffered." Part 8. Mark's breakdown. The days blurred into nights, and time became meaningless within the suffocating confines of Mark's home. The once familiar surroundings now felt alien, as though the house itself had turned against him. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows stretched unnaturally, and every creak of the floorboards was a reminder that he was not alone. Mark had stopped trying to sleep. The moment he closed his eyes, Bruno's glowing orbs appeared in his mind, burning with rage and betrayal. He would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the echo of ghostly growls reverberating in his ears. His mind, fractured by guilt and fear, teetered on the edge of madness. "Stop it," he screamed into the empty room, his voice hoarse and broken. "I can't take it anymore." The response was a low, guttural growl, emanating from the shadows. Mark spun around, clutching a broken chair leg like a weapon. His eyes darted wildly, but the room appeared empty. The growl grew louder, surrounding him, pressing against his ears until he dropped the makeshift weapon and clutched his head. "Please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Leave me alone." The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened. Mark's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the walls seemed to close in around him. He backed into a corner, his body trembling uncontrollably. The whispers began, faint and indistinct, like a distant wind carrying secrets he was never meant to hear. "You killed me," the voice hissed, barely audible but unmistakably Bruno's. "You betrayed me." Mark shook his head violently, his hands covering his ears. "No, it wasn't like that. I didn't mean to." The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of accusations. Mark pressed himself tighter into the corner, his nails digging into his scalp. "I'm sorry," he screamed. "I'm sorry." The shadows moved, coalescing into Bruno's spectral form. The dog's eyes glowed with an unholy light, and his growl filled the room. Mark's sobs turned into wails as the ghost advanced, its presence suffocating and inescapable. "You will suffer," Bruno said, his voice cold and merciless. "You will never know peace." Mark crawled away on his hands and knees, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He knocked over a table, sending its contents crashing to the floor. But he didn't stop. His only thought was to escape, though deep down he knew there was no escape. Bruno's vengeance was relentless, and the ghost would not rest until Mark was completely broken. The whispers and growls followed him as he stumbled into the kitchen. He clutched the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, as he tried to steady himself. His reflection in the window caught his eye, and he froze. The man staring back at him was unrecognizable, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and pale as death. "Who am I?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. The reflection didn't answer, but the shadows behind it shifted, revealing Bruno's glowing eyes. Mark screamed and swung his arm wildly, shattering the glass. The shards rained down around him, cutting into his hands, but he didn't feel the pain. Blood dripped onto the floor as Mark staggered back into the living room. The whispers had returned, now louder and more distinct. They spoke of betrayal, guilt, and retribution, each word a dagger that pierced Mark's fragile psyche. He collapsed onto the floor, curling into a ball as he rocked back and forth. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore." The shadows seemed to mock him, their movements almost playful as they danced around the room. Bruno's form appeared again, larger and more menacing than before. The ghost's growl was low and rumbling, shaking the very walls of the house. "You will know what it feels like to be powerless," Bruno said, his voice filled with cold fury. Mark's screams echoed through the house, but no one heard them. The villagers had long since stopped visiting, their fear of the house and its haunted occupant keeping them away. Mark was completely alone, trapped in his personal nightmare. The torment continued day after day. Mark stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped caring about anything but the relentless presence that haunted him. His once clear thoughts were now a chaotic storm of guilt, fear, and despair. He spoke to the shadows, begged for forgiveness, and lashed out at unseen enemies. His sanity had been eroded, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. One night, as the whispers reached their peak, Mark stood in the middle of the living room, his body trembling and his mind fractured. "Take me," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "End this. Please, just end this." Bruno appeared once more, his glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "Your suffering has only just begun," the ghost said. His voice was calm, almost serene, but it carried a weight that crushed Mark's spirit. The spectral dog advanced, his form flickering like a dying flame. Mark fell to his knees, his hands clasped together as though in prayer. "Please," he begged, his tears falling freely. "I can't live like this. I can't." The room grew silent, the whispers and growls fading into nothingness. For a brief moment, Mark felt a flicker of hope. But then Bruno's voice cut through the silence, colder and more final than ever. "This is your penance." The shadows enveloped Mark, their cold touch seeping into his very soul. His screams were swallowed by the darkness, leaving the house silent once more. When the first rays of dawn broke through the cracks in the boarded windows, they illuminated a man reduced to nothing but a muttering wreck. Mark sat in the middle of the room, his eyes vacant and his body trembling. The villagers would later speak of the house, of the strange noises that came from within, and the man who had lost himself to his guilt. They avoided the place, their whispers carrying the weight of fear and superstition. And inside, Mark remained, haunted by the phantom eyes that watched him from every corner and the whispers that never ceased. Bruno's retribution was complete, and Mark was left to live out the rest of his days in a torment that no one could save him from. Part 9. Cautionary legend. Willow Creek was never the same after the events that transpired within Mark's house. The village, once peaceful and unassuming, became shrouded in unease, a place where whispers of tragedy lingered in every shadow. The house on the hill, with its dark silhouette and crumbling facade, became the center of a tale that grew darker and more haunting with each retelling. Mark's house stood as a reminder of what had been lost and what had been unleashed. The villagers, terrified by the stories of strange noises, flickering lights, and the faint sound of claws scratching on wood, avoided it at all costs. The windows, perpetually dark, seemed like eyes watching over the village, a silent observer of their every move. No one dared venture near. Mark himself had faded into a shadow of a man. His once vibrant presence in the village had been replaced by an existence shrouded in madness and torment. Those who wandered too close to the house claimed to hear him muttering, begging for forgiveness, or screaming in agony during the dead of night. His cries, filled with despair, became part of the living nightmare that enveloped Willow Creek. The story of Mark and Bruno grew into a cautionary legend, one that parents told their children on stormy nights. Around fires or under the glow of lanterns, they spoke of loyalty betrayed, of guilt that could not be escaped. The legend served as a grim warning about the cost of cruelty and the power of remorse. Mark wasn't an evil man, one elder often began, her voice heavy with sorrow. But he let recklessness and cruelty guide his hand. He betrayed the loyalty of a dog who trusted him more than anything. And in doing so, he sealed his fate. The children huddled together, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, as the elder's voice dropped to a whisper. Bruno wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian, a symbol of trust. And when you shatter trust, it doesn't just disappear, it fights back over time. The villagers began attributing every misfortune to Bruno's restless spirit. Failed crops, sudden illnesses, and even the eerie cries of foxes at night were seen as signs of the ghostly dog's lingering presence. To ward off his wrath, they left offerings at the edge of Mark's property, bones, candles and flowers arranged with trembling hands. One night, during a fierce storm, a traveler passing through Willow Creek stopped at the local tavern. He scoffed at the villagers' fears, dismissing their tales as the fabrications of overly superstitious minds. "A haunted dog," he laughed. And a man driven mad by guilt? Surely you can't expect me to believe such nonsense. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Finally the barkeep leaned forward, his voice low and grave. Believe what you want, stranger. But no one here mocks that story, and no one who does sets foot near that house emboldened by drink. The traveler decided to prove the villagers wrong. I'll go, he declared, slamming his mug on the table. And when I return, you'll see there's nothing to fear. The villagers watched him leave, their faces pale with dread. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the streets like a mournful cry. Hours passed and the village grew quieter, save for the occasional roll of thunder. By morning, the traveler's body was found near the riverbank. His face was frozen in an expression of abject terror, his hands clawed and bloody, as if he had tried to fend off an unseen attacker. The discovery sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The villagers doubled their offerings and avoided speaking of the incident, hoping to appease Bruno's wrath. But the story of the traveler only deepened the legend, cementing the house as a place of dark power and unrelenting vengeance. Decades passed, and Mark's fate became a parable, a grim warning passed down through generations. The house, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by wildflowers, stood untouched. Some said the flowers were a sign of Bruno's lingering spirit, their vibrant colors contrasting sharply with the decay within. Others believed they marked the boundary of the curse, a line no living thing dared cross. Children dared each other to approach the house, to press their ears against the door, and listen for Mark's muttering. Those who were brave or foolish enough swore they heard the faint sound of claws scratching against wood and the low, mournful growl of a dog. They always ran back to the village, breathless and pale, vowing never to return. For the villagers, the story of Mark and Bruno was more than a ghost story. It was a lesson, a stark reminder of the consequences of thoughtless cruelty. Parents used it to teach their children about the importance of kindness and the dangers of betraying trust. Never betray someone who loves you, they would say. Because love, once betrayed, can become the most relentless curse of all. The house still stands to this day, its windows like darkened eyes, its walls bearing the scars of Mark's torment. No one knows if Mark remains within, trapped in an endless cycle of guilt and fear, or if his spirit has joined Bruno's in eternal penance. The villagers continue to avoid it, their whispers filled with fear and caution. And when the wind blows just right, carrying with it the faint sound of growls and whispers, they lower their voices and murmur a quiet prayer. For in Willow Creek, the story of Mark and Bruno is not just a legend, it is a warning etched into the village's very foundation, a testament to the price of cruelty and the unrelenting power of guilt. Some say that on the darkest nights, if you stand at the edge of the property and listen closely, you can hear two voices intertwined. One, a man's, broken and pleading for forgiveness. The other, a dog's, growling low and steady, a chilling reminder of betrayal and retribution.